You talk about choice, and we think that we have all this choice when it comes to our emotions, and sometimes we don't have as much choice as we think we do, because sometimes those emotions are in us in a way, um, that we don't have choice, that suddenly suddenly we are triggered, and for me, it's to free up more choice. For me, that's the goal, is to free up more choice so that when the trigger happens, when, um, I find myself in a place that I have more freedom around that because I've explored so many so many of the things that have happened in my life, and um so I get more choice around triggering moments, because I've healed.
Good day, listeners. You're listening to the Spiritual Artist Podcast. This is CJ Miller, your host. It is a very stormy day here in Dallas, so I hope the connection doesn't get us cut off. But I am really excited. Probably of all my guests that I've ever had on this show, this one is someone I've known so long, and we've gone through so many things together. And I'm so excited to bring Lora in. Let me tell you who she is, and then I'm going to talk about how we know each other so well. So, Reverend Lora Brandis is a Unitarian Universalist minister with experience as a congregational minister, a hospital chaplain, and a spiritual director. Her personal experience navigating grief informs her ministry and her spiritual practice. I'm really excited to get into this whole concept of how do we navigate grief? How do we process it? And how do we deal with triggers that sometimes bring these emotions right back to us every day? So, a good day, Laura. I'm so excited to have you here.
It's great to be here.
I have to tell my listeners how we know each other. Okay.
Okay.
So, years ago, when I was running my ad agency, I had a client and it was a theater, and Laura worked at this theater. And we met, and she was my point of contact. And I will tell you, listeners, we got to know each other very well. And then I needed to hire an assistant. So I actually reached out to Laura and I kind of stole her away from my client. She was unhappy where she was, and she came to work for me. And I want to tell you, after Laura worked for me, she worked 4 years. Was it 4 or 5 years?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, it was a long
Yeah.
time. And what listeners, not only that, but then Laura decided to go back and study to be a minister. And during that period, she also worked for me part-time on call, in and out, while she studied ministry. And at that time, I wasn't in the ministry or studying any at all, very little, just my New Thought books. And so we've kind of round robined it here, and we're both grown more and more in the ministry. And then Laura went off to California, right? And
Mhm. Yeah.
manage a congregation, and that was a whole journey for you.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it was, and then I came back to Dallas, right? So it's been a lot of journeying, and a lot of, learning about what it means to be a minister, right? And also just, the personal journey that kind of paralleled alongside my ministerial journey, really.
Right. I mean, it's so funny to think back. I think I've talked to you about this many years ago, that when you worked for me, I realized that I was looking for someone that would create a sort of a maternal support for me that I don't feel like I had. I'll just leave it at that, listeners. And so Laura and I became fast friends, and literally, right? I mean, in the middle of the workday, we would like take walks, and we would go out and walk around the block and just not only talk about work issues, but talk about issues in our lives. That's
Yeah, I'm remembering, and you probably remember this, we read, Eckhart Tolle, however you say it, however you choose to say it. We read his first book together, right?
Yeah, I forgot about that, but we did.
And we did. I mean, we read it together, and I still remember reading that one passage that said, if a log is on fire and it sits next to or put next to one that's not on fire or maybe not burning as brightly, that one that's next to it catches fire, catches more fire. And I always felt like that's what we were doing, right? Is we were catching each other's spiritual fire. And I mean, I remember that. Yeah.
Wow, you never told me that. I've never heard that.
Mhm.
And you know what? It's ironic because even back then, I don't know if our listeners would realize this. I had an ad agency, and I had graphic designers and web designers and copywriters. But the irony of all this is I always was trying to bring spirituality into the office.
Right.
And that's,
Yeah.
we actually read that book I want to share as part of the office. I think, we would sit down and read it first thing in the morning and then go off and
Mhm.
work and deal with our clients and look at how work affects you spiritually, you
Mhm.
know? And and so it's been funny because each of us have constantly, we keep evolving. And now I feel like only now, and this is many years later, have I started really committing to merging these two sides of me, the spiritual and what I do for a living. And that's how the whole spiritual artist came from, the whole book and everything. Um, and so I want to share with our listeners, Lora, you've had such a challenging life in many ways. And you're open, and I will leave it as a safe space. You can share what you want to share and not what you don't. But you did work as a hospital chaplain for a while. Explain to our listeners how taxing and stressful that can be. And
Well, I'm still doing that actually. And I do it out, on call, and in fact, last night I was on call. So when I'm on call, that means from 7 o'clock at night till 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm at home, and my beeper could go off, and luckily it didn't last night. I have had many occasions where it has gone off, and I have to do something the next day, and you know, it's challenging. But so what happens when I'm on call is uh, I usually get called in for a death, or sometimes it's someone who's come into the emergency room and they've collapsed and they're being worked on. So they're getting CPR, and there's family. And so my job as the chaplain is to sit with the family until maybe the patient is stabilized, or quite often, sometimes they die, certainly. um, so yeah, it's I hesitate to say that I really love it, but I do love it. I had someone once say to me as I was sitting with them and her loved one was being worked on in the emergency room. She said, "Wow, I mean, why do you do this?"
yeah,
And I said, "Because you deserve to have someone with you while you're going through this. And I'm a witness, right? And so I just feel like people deserve to have that witness while they're experiencing what can be very traumatic."
wow. I mean, I agree. It's to most people, and especially here in the West, we're also like we hide death behind a curtain. We don't, people just kind of disappear, and we don't really have much ritual involved in saying goodbye and letting go.
Right.
Um, and I give you, I just wow, the strength to do that.
And then if you put my personal story on top of that work, it's interesting, and I think it goes back to what you want to talk about, maybe about what we do with our triggers, because um I've experienced some deaths of family members in the emergency room. And I mean, my story is that in a 2-year period, my stepdaughter died, my daughter died, my ex-husband died, and my best friend from college died. And it was all within 2 years. And yeah, that's a lot. And
Mm.
usually when I explain that to people, there's usually silence on the other end of that. Um, And then sometimes I rush in and start taking care of them, and then I wait a minute, stop that. But so when I
Wow.
walk into, and this happened to me just the other day, maybe a couple weeks ago, um, a 66-year-old man collapsed at home. They call, the emergency personnel, and they work on him the whole way in the ambulance to the hospital. And the family shows up, and the doctor meets them, and I'm sort of walking towards them. And in fact, the son said to me, I actually met them first, and then took them to the doctor. And the son said to me, um, "Do you show up for all of these?"
Oh, wow. Mhm.
Because he knew, right? I mean, that's the thing. As soon as you say you're the chaplain, it's like, okay. So I just said, yeah, I show up for all these. But it wasn't good news, and it wasn't going to be good news. And it was so very similar to how my ex husband collapsed at home, got worked on in the ambulance, got taken to the hospital, and there was nothing they could do. And so I see those similarities. I feel those similarities, but it's been 3 years now, and, I actually happened to see his widow at our Mother's Day celebration on I mean, uh, obviously, we have, had a really good relationship when he died, and we just have a really good blended family. And I saw her, and I told her, it made me think of her because it was so similar to the way James had died. And 3 years later, she's just it's still really hard. I mean, the grief journey is really hard for her. Um and I think that goes back to what you were saying about we just don't talk about it. So I talk about it. I talk a lot about it. And I think sometimes people think, oh, don't talk about it. Will you stop it? But, I mean, I have walked through all of this, I think, so that I can be with people and sit with them and witness for them. Um, and that you don't ever get over it, but it changes and the triggers change. And I know that that's, one of the things you wanted to explore with me, that the triggers change, the way they trigger you changes. So I was not triggered when I was sitting with that family. I could be with
Wow.
them.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. You said that you talk about it. How important is it for us to talk about these things, to acknowledge them?
I think it's incredibly important. As you say, we don't talk. We are shy of talking about death. We're afraid to talk about death. I think we're afraid of the sadness that we see in other people. You know, um, like I said, when I tell my story, and it does kind of stop conversation, and I have to make choices around, um, like if I'm meeting someone for the first time, or they're trying to get to know me better, and they'll say, "How many children do you have?"
Oh,
And in that moment, I have to make a choice, right? And I used to be a part of a grief group that was for parents only because it's a different kind of grief, right? It's a different journey for parents who have lost a child, who have lost an adult child. And we talk about, well, what do you say when people say, how many children do you have? And for me, it really depends on what the context is. So there's something about just acknowledging death, I think, that it gives it space to understand that we're all dying. We're all dying. There's
right.
no escaping that. and it's gonna be sad, and people are gonna miss us. And we just wanna run away from that. We wanna run away from there's like a denial of death that runs through religion, that runs through our
Oh, it's
society. Yeah, it's there's a denial of death.
well, it's like, I talk about how important emotions are as we are creators, and there's so many emotions that we just try to hold off, right? I'm not going to feel sadness. I'm not going to feel hurt or loss, and that's all part of the spectrum, you know.
Right.
I want to share this with our listeners because I think they'll find this fascinating. Is that you spent many years as an actress, and that you come from the theater.
Okay, well, I wouldn't ever, give me any kind of, I don't usually put actor or actress, by my experience. I have acting training. I have a degree in theater from many, many, many years ago in my undergraduate. Um, but mostly I was a director and a teacher. I didn't do a lot of acting. I did some acting. Um, and yeah, I'm also, I still also preach. I'm still also in the pulpit about once a
Yeah.
month for a small congregation here in the area. So yeah, that informs. Um, I think I kinda know why you brought that up. I mean, it informs my creative approach, right?
Right,
I mean,
right.
absolutely, it informs my creative approach to what I do, what my life is. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely, creativity is a piece of who I am.
Well, I was thinking back to I referenced my husband Terry Martin in my book, and he talks about emotions and how they're energy in motion. Emotions are energy in motion, and we have to let them flow through us. And so I was thinking about what you were saying when you have that grief and you try to block it or hold it back or don't talk about it. You're not letting it flow through you.
So here's a term I had never heard before till I started reading all the books because that's me. Um, I'm gonna figure this out, right? I'm gonna figure it out. How am I doing it right? When is this gonna be over? How does the book tell you how to do this? I mean, I did all of that, right? So here's a term that I learned: metabolize grief. How are you metabolizing your grief? So when you think about metabolizing, we usually think of food, right? We usually think of it going through the body, we metabolize it, and then it comes out. And you
Right.
know, so metabolize grief. I seriously had never ever seen that before until my daughter died, and I started reading all these books. And looking back, I realize intuitively that's what I did. Um, Zoe died in January of 2020. So we all know what happens next. Um,
Yeah, really.
and yeah, and so the pandemic shut everything down. I was still serving a church full time at the time. I brought my office here where it is now. I brought worship here. I recorded worship from here for every Sunday. It's a little isolating. And when you think that, and then my stepdaughter had died 6 months before that. So my husband and I were in this house, isolated on our grief journeys. And I used to talk about how I would what did I call it? I would call it stand and sob. And maybe I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had to go to the office every day, if I had to be with the people every Sunday, which is more of a giving than a receiving place, right? But I could move through my day, however I wanted to construct it, and I literally would do this thing. I would do this thing where I might be walking across the house, and maybe something would trigger me, and I would just stop and I would sob. And what I realized after that is that I was metabolizing my grief. I was metabolizing my grief without really having that name for it until I read all those books.
Right. Well, that's interesting. Even having a name for it is important, that you understand that it's a process,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
Um, and it's
yeah,
not a process that you can rush or that you can direct, really.
no,
You just have to
no,
go through it.
right. And we want to put a timeline on it. There's a great book and by Megan Devine called "It's Okay That You're Not Okay." And she has a TED Talk, and I always recommend it. She also has I wrote it down so I would remember. I'm looking at it over here. Um, refugeingrief.com, and she talk about creative process. She has a writing process that she does that you can join for a month. Of course, there's a fee and it's facilitated and you're put into a group. And I did it in July. Yeah, Zoe died in January. I did it in July. And you have a writing prompt every day, and then you share it as you want to, and then you with each other, right? With each other, you get feedback. So other grieving people not, that was a great piece of writing. No, it's not about that. It was, oh my gosh, when you said this, it reminded me of this, or so we're talking to each other about our grief process. And I think doing that really helped me metabolize a lot of my grief, um, and to tell
That
the story.
Yeah, there's so many things you just said that are so interesting. I'm reading that a book called Your Brain on Art, and they talk about writing and how that moves things through you, um, and it helps you process it,
Mhm.
and it comes to a certain level. But also, what I like about what you said is when you share it with other people, you're developing community and you're realizing, I'm a big, I have, this is probably one of my biggest hangups. I want to do it alone. I don't need anybody, and I've stepped out of organized religion. I've stepped out of all this structure, but it can be lonely. And how important it is to realize you're not alone. There's other people that are feeling this, you know,
Right.
and
It's I'm an issue a caution about these groups too, because I heard this. So I took a yoga for grief workshop. Telling you, I've done it all. And that's what we joke, Frank, my husband and I would joke. I've done everything, Frank's done nothing. And so
that's
so that's
interesting. You
our
got to control, yeah.
yeah. So but that's also because people grieve differently. And
Right.
that is the thing to remember. People grieve differently. And in this yoga for grief workshop that I took, one woman said, "Yeah, I went to one of those groups and it felt like all they did was tell the same story over and
Mhm.
over and over and over." And I get that. I think that is a cautionary tale in that, but only we can monitor that in ourselves, I think. Um, and maybe for her, she needed to move on to a different group, right? And I do think we need to be careful about um, telling the story over and over in a way that doesn't metabolize the grief, right? That just keeps us there in the story, right? One of the things that I did right away, and I would say that writing is one of my spiritual practices, journaling and writing sermons, and writing. Well, I used to write a blog. I don't anymore, but um, well, but writing is definitely a spiritual practice for me. And one of the things I did, I don't know, again, just kind of as a gift to myself, because I knew if I didn't, I would I would relive Zoe's death and the day that she died over and over and over and over. So what I did, and it took me some time, took me several weeks, is I wrote it all down. Every single detail of the day that she died, I wrote down so that I would have it, but also that I didn't go over it in my mind. I wouldn't keep ruminating, right? And every time I would go there, I would say, "Oh, You don't have to go there. You write it down. It's there. You're not going to forget because it's there. It's okay. So I think
Yeah.
it really, really helped me.
It's interesting. There's a part of us, right? There's almost a guilt of, I don't want to forget this. I don't want to forget this. So I have to keep running it through my head. And so writing it down does alleviate a little bit of that,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that's a piece of the grief journey that most everyone goes through is if I somehow forget, then I've forgotten them,
Right. Yeah.
you know. Or if I don't feel the grief as intensely as I did 4 years ago, that somehow I'm doing their life a disservice. Um, and I don't think that's true. It hasn't been true for me. Um, it's just the relationship changes. I mean, I still have a relationship with all those people who I've
Right.
lost. I mean, I really do, and I really do talk to them, and I really do. I mean, even now, I'm holding this crystal, which doesn't look really great on camera, but um, it's a heart. It's a pink quartz crystal that's a heart, and I gave it to Zoe years and years ago because she struggled with alcoholism. She died at 28 from her disease, and I gave it to her, I don't know how many years ago at this point, probably about 10 years ago, uh, and then, it came back to me when she died, and it's a touchstone for me, but it's not a touchstone of poor, pitiful me, these horrible things happen to me. It's more of a touchstone of she's my daughter and I love her and I'll never stop loving her. And she informs who I am and how I am in this world. And that's my touchstone.
Wow. You know, it's just, we've talked about so many things and I could think we could just, there's so much more. There's so much to talk about. Um, but we talk about triggers, right? And I'll share with the listeners. I visited you a couple weeks ago, and I was talking about how I was processing something that was triggering in me, and then Laura shared how there was something triggering in her, and and we were questioning. I want to share this with my listeners also. When I do my retreats, my spiritual art retreats, I'm helping people become more holistic artists, and when I do that, I have found, Laura, a lot of people have bad trauma
Mm,
about being an
mhm,
artist, trauma about being creative, trauma about being shamed for their creativity. And so always a part of my retreat is some sort of exercise to have that touchstone and look back and say, this happened, this happened, but I have the choice to reframe it, move on. But that doesn't mean it's ever going to be painless, as we talked about, right? Because, I think the way our brains work, back to that book, is there's so many ways something could be a trigger, right? I mean, you think it's a glass heart. Well, then you're watching a commercial for a Hallmark and there's a little glass heart on the table and you're like, right? Sometimes you don't even know what the trigger is. You're like, suddenly I feel really sad. I feel so sad. Yeah, I want to share this with our listeners. Not yesterday, but the day before, I just felt such a heaviness. I just felt so sad. And all I can do is just say, okay, I'm going to feel sad,
mhm,
you know? And
mhm,
it lasted probably till about 2 in the afternoon. I just felt this weight, this sadness. I don't know what the trigger was, right?
mhm. Yeah,
And I
yeah.
don't know if we all I don't know if we go, and I don't know if it's worth trying. I've met people that say, well, you have to figure out the trigger. I don't know if you do. What do you think? Do you have to figure out the trigger or do you just feel it?
Yeah, I think the danger of always having to figure everything out is that we get into this fixing mode, and that drives me crazy. You know, it's my Facebook feed of all the advertisements of, do this, it works. Take this class, it works. And it's probably because, the algorithm knows me, but still, um, I do think that we can get a little bit into if I just do, and speaking from experience, if I just do one more thing, if I just figure this one out, then I'll be better. Then I'll never be triggered again, or whatever that thought is that you have. So yeah, I think sometimes just sit with a feeling, just sit with it, just sit with it, just sit with it, and watch how it moves, watch how it gets metabolized, right? Because I think it eventually does. Now, sure, some people need, a therapist. Some people need medication management. I mean, this is not to say, this is not to take lightly, certainly, um, that some people need help to get through some of the darkest moments in their lives. You talk about choice, and we think that we have all this choice when it comes to our emotions, and sometimes we don't have as much choice as we think we do, because sometimes those emotions are in us in a way, um, that we don't have choice, that suddenly we are triggered, and for me, it's to free up more choice. That's for me, that's the goal, is to free up more choice so that when the trigger happens, when, um, I find myself in a place that I have more freedom around that, because I've explored so many so many of the things that have happened in my life, and um so I get more choice around triggering moments, because I've healed.
But that's something interesting that you said there. Really interesting for me is to recognize that we're not always a choice to feel it. I mean, we just have it. It's there. It's there. And me, I'm a big, I'm very guilty of choose, and like I did 2 days ago, I just said, okay, I'm just gonna sit in this. For me, writing is therapeutic, but also making art, taking that emotion and painting something. I actually painted something and I shared it yesterday with a person and said, does this make you feel sad? Because it's kind of, it's dark,
Yeah,
but moody,
sure.
but it was therapeutic, you know?
Mhm,
And as I say to my artists, there's no wrong in creativity. I felt it and I painted it. Um,
mhm.
but I love that. Maybe, that it's kind of going into that surrender, right? Surrendering to it,
Right,
you know?
right.
So, how do you deal with that? You've told us about writing, and I talked about art, um, and acknowledging it and feeling it. So, triggers are going to happen, right? I mean,
Mhm.
do you think you'll ever be without a trigger about your daughter and your daughter-in-law and stepdaughter?
Stepdaughter.
Yeah.
Um, um, yeah, I don't think so. Writing is a spiritual practice for me. Meditation and prayer is a spiritual practice for me. Uh, Reading in a way that's not just reading a novel, although sometimes novels can be great as far
Right.
as processing emotions, right? But we talk about lectio divina in religious life. And Lectio Divina is that practice where you take maybe a poem or just a piece of writing, or for some people it's scripture, and you go more deeply into the text to feel the resonances, and that can be a spiritual practice that helps with feelings and inner awareness. So I think it's more of what are your spiritual practice is painting, right? Gardening, I would say, would be one
Yeah.
of your spiritual practices, right? I know a lot of people where gardening is a spiritual practice. And so I think that we each have to just you know, determine what those spiritual practices are. The other thing I would say is, comes from a mentor of mine who says, "Find your squad," she says. She says, "Find your squad." So, and you and I have talked about this, how there are maybe only 2 or 3 people in your life that is really safe for you to go to with some of this stuff, and so find your squad, and for some of us, our therapist is
Yeah.
part of our squad. I mean, I have a therapist, I have a spiritual director who is part of my squad, I have friends, you are part of my squad. I have, people that I can go to when, when I've been triggered. I will say sometimes my husband is not part of my squad. And that's an okay thing. I mean, that is really okay because he's really close to some of it, right? And so
Right.
it's hard for him to just step back and listen to me sometimes because then he gets triggered.
Well, that's interesting. I had a moment with my husband last night where he actually was my squad. He was so supportive. But there are times, you're right, when you're both going through it together, um, and it's not the same. And I want to share this with our listener. Maybe you can elaborate on it. Be very careful about who you choose as your squad. We
Mhm.
all, I don't know, I've had people that I get a weak moment and I call and I let them see that side of me. And then suddenly they step into, well, you shouldn't feel that way, or they shame it, or you're supposed to be the spiritual artist, and I'm like, but I'm still human, right? And so you got to be
Yeah.
careful, about who
Mhm.
you pick for that. I call it your cheerleader team, right?
Yeah.
You know,
Right. Right. And that's a boundary thing, right? I mean, that's just what are healthy boundaries? And sometimes we discover in painful ways what healthy
right?
boundaries are because it's like, oh, I guess I shouldn't have shared that with that person, and I have to have a better boundary with them about my personal life, and families. I talked about this too, and sometimes our families of origin are not they're just not safe places, and I don't mean to joke about it or take it lightly, but sometimes our families of origin are not safe places. They're just not, and that's sad, and there's grief. I mean,
Mm.
there's another place where grief shows up, and so then we get to process that grief as well and create our chosen family, and then we just create that.
Yeah, that's important. I just remembered our conversation from a couple weeks ago. It's so funny you said that. Um, it is true. Sometimes our family of origin can actually be our trigger, or
Mhm.
the fact that we didn't get what we thought we should have gotten as a child, right?
Right,
Now,
right.
that doesn't mean you have to hate them or feel ill will, but you also have to have your boundary, like you said, and share what's safe, and then don't worry about it. You know?
And listen, you may have to go through anger with them, and that's okay too. But that's why, we have safe places to take that anger to, so that we're not dumping on our family, who sometimes maybe even clueless about where that anger is coming from. So, yeah, I mean, it's okay to get angry about that as well.
Yeah, I love that because what I've realized is most people don't consciously hurt each other. So sometimes when someone has disappointed you, it's not that they tried to disappoint you or they have any ill wills towards you. They just don't have the self-awareness and consciousness to know what they're doing. And
Yeah,
so, that's a step toward loving, eternal love, just saying, okay, I see who they are, and I'm going to keep myself safe. I call it little Chris safe from that. I
right,
won't put you
right,
there anymore. I'll say,
right,
hey, little Chris, I'm not going to put you underneath that anymore. You don't have to
right.
listen to that person, but you can still hold that Christ nature, the Christ love for them, right? Which you should. So this has been a great conversation, and is there? I love all the things we talked about with these triggers. Is there anything about this process? You talk about being a witness, right? Um, are you also witnessing yourself when you have a trigger? Are you serving? Are you serving as the witness of yourself?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think you can most definitely. I also think, we make meaning. That's what we do. We're meaning making creatures. And some of us pour that meaning through, maybe through a religion, and then that becomes the way we make meaning in our lives. Some of us pour it through our art, and that's how we make meaning in our lives. And the thing about a trigger is how am I making meaning now in this moment? And I like to tell the story of how um, so my daughter, my oldest daughter, and her husband moved back to Dallas after my daughter died, and her sister died, and her stepsister died, and they bought a house during the pandemic in a neighborhood very close to where she grew up. And when she had her twins, I'm the nanny, and so at first, when I would drive to her house, I realized I was driving by the preschool where Zoe was. So
Wow.
every day that I was driving to Sarah's house, I'm driving by this reminder of little Zoe, of little sweet Zoe, at her preschool. And at first it was like, oh my God, do I have to do this? And now I do it. I've been doing it for 2.5 years, and I have to drive by this preschool where my daughter who died went as a sweet little girl. And it's changed, and the meaning of it has changed, and it's turned more into, again, a celebration of her and who she once was, and how I loved her and how she loved me. And there she is, a sweet little reminder um, of who she once was. So the trigger can change if we let it, and how we make meaning of our lives and is what it becomes, I think. It's how we make meaning of it.
Oh, wow. That's lovely, Laura. I was thinking about Father Richard Rohr. He uses a word called transmutation,
Mm,
transmute.
mhm,
And so I
mhm.
love that when you said that, how you change your meaning and let it evolve. It just really, I could feel that, you know, for you. Oh, wow. That was wonderful. Um, I love it. So, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners about triggers and working through grief and being your own witness?
Just make sure you have your squad, I would say. My latest project is spiritual direction. I'm launching a spiritual direction um, business. And and you keep asking me, well, what is spiritual direction? What is that anyway?
Yeah.
So it really is, talk about witness. As a spiritual director, I am witnessing the presence of spirit, the holy God, whatever you call it, move in your life, and maybe reminding those that I witness, if they're not noticing. Hey,
Yeah.
hang on, notice that. Notice that. What's going on? Where's that? Where is the movement of spirit in your life? So yeah, I just would encourage that noticing, and and that just how grateful I am to be able to be a witness.
That's lovely. Well, I wish you all the best of luck with that, the spiritual director and your new website. And we'll put that in the bio. People will give you information
Awesome.
about how to find you, and hopefully you'll start blogging again because your stories are really wonderful. And there's that resonance. They talk about resonance with another, like you talk about in the community groups. And when you read someone else, listen to someone else read their journal, how there's a resonance and a recognition that we are all one, right? That we're all one, you know. So I want to thank you for being on the show, and I hope you'll come back because this is great. Listeners, make sure you follow me on YouTube or on the podcast. Share me with your friends because I'd like to expand my reach. It's part of what I feel is my spiritual direction and what I love to do with and help people. And also check out my website, spiritualartisttoday.com, for information on my spiritual art retreats, where you do get to create and make art, but you also can be self-aware and learn more about who you are, what your triggers are, and how you can actually use them in making art. So thank you for listening to the Spiritual Artist Podcast, and we will talk to you soon. Goodbye, Lora.
Bye.